So hello and welcome to Earnscliffe Strategies webinar, Critical Minerals, Geopolitical Tensions and Opportunity. My name is Bud Locklear. I'm a principal with Earnscliffe Strategies, a national leader in strategic communications, government relations, and opinion research with offices in Ottawa, Toronto, Saskatoon, and Vancouver. I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So Brad, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bud. Pleasure to be here today. My name is Brad Simmons. I'm a senior director for energy and natural resources with Bauer Group Asia. It's a strategic advisory firm with 28 offices across the Asia Pacific region, supporting clients across a number of different sectors. I'm former U.S. government, actually only just 5 weeks into the job at Bauer Group Asia. Most recently was with the Department of Energy, where I led the Office of International Market Development. Thanks.
Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Sure. Hello, my name is Mark Camilleri. I'm a Canadian EU qualified lawyer in Brussels, where I engage in an EU regulatory practice, really helping mostly Canadian businesses manage the risks and opportunities of the EU single market. I'm also the president of the Canada-EU Trade and Investment Association, a Brussels-based not-for-profit organization aimed at promoting the Canada-EU trade and investment relationship. I've been living in the EU for over 15 years now, Brussels for over 10, and I take a particular interest in the Canada-EU file. Critical minerals is a key part of this relationship, and I'm confident will become an even bigger part of it. So I'm very happy to be here today to discuss this with you. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Great, thanks, Mark. Marianne.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marianne Carter. I'm a principal with our government relations practice at Earnscliffe Strategies, based out of our Ottawa office. I've been with the company for 5 years. I work very closely with Bud Locklear on critical minerals files and some of our team across the country. I take a real specific interest in this issue, given my background is focused predominantly in international trade work. Prior to joining the team at Earnscliffe, I worked at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce as the legal affairs director. And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation we're having today.
Great. Thank you, Marianne. So let me set the stage for today's webinar. The world's largest mining and minerals conference just was held in Toronto last week. And attending PDAC 2023 were companies big and small that mine everything from bauxite to gold to uranium. But the elements that garnered the most attention at PDAC 2023 were the critical minerals necessary to build electric vehicles and to move our economies toward a net zero future. A key objective of North American governments and the European governments is to establish, to the greatest extent possible, a complete value chain for electric vehicle manufacturing in their jurisdictions. A necessary condition for that is to ensure essential critical minerals and inputs are sourced and processed within those jurisdictions, or at least from friendly allies. A major constraint on this ambition, however, is that China currently refines the majority of many of the most important critical minerals, the world's cobalt, rare earth elements, and extracts almost the entirety of the world's graphite, which is, each of these are essential for the EV value chain. And today, that's what we want to talk about. Our panel is going to examine how Canada, the United States, EU are positioning themselves to eliminate this dependence on China and explore what this development means for the production, processing, and value add of critical minerals here in Canada, in the USA, and the EU. So panelists, let's start with brief remarks from each of you to share your perspective on this challenge and set the stage for the conversation. I'll start with Brad.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bud. Appreciate that scene set of remarks. I thought it might be helpful for me just to offer a little bit of context and background regarding how the U.S. government looks at these issues, given my experience there. And I think that will then flow nicely into some of the more specific conversation that we'll have subsequent to that. But as the director in the Office for Market Development, one of my responsibilities with the Department of Energy was overseeing our international clean energy technology supply chain strategy. A major focus of that was, of course, critical minerals and materials, and looking at diversification and resilience of those supply chains, as well as reducing some of the dependencies that we had on China. But at a fundamental level, the way that we really looked at critical mineral supply chains distilled down to a singular objective, which was we did not want to end up in a scenario where critical mineral and material supply adequacy was the arbiter of the pace of our energy transition. So with that in mind, one of the earliest exercises that we undertook within the Biden administration was a real reexamination of US geologic assets to really understand recoverable reserves and project it out with the investments the administration was planning to make, what we thought the domestic production potential looked like. That gave us a rough roadmap to understand how to balance our domestic and international policy initiatives, and as well as in establishing priorities for securing supplies to enable the administration to meet its various targets and policy objectives related to emissions reduction and technology deployment. At the same time, we recognize existing Chinese industrial prowess and key technologies and the production of key associated precursor materials was something that was going to be a significant challenge for us as we strove for supply chain resiliency. So as we were working through our critical minerals policy, there was a very real, stark and tangible example of what that dependency could portend for US security and the collision that could occur between US climate ambitions with our foreign policy values. And that was taking place in the solar supply chain, where revelations surrounding forced labor and the manufacturing capacity that existed in the Xinjiang region caused severe disruptions when those were revealed in the public fora, and severely challenged the United States and its deployment objectives associated with solar technology in the domestic marketplace. So as a result, I think there was a real emerging intolerance for the emerging dependencies in these key decarbonization technologies. And that was very much applicable to the lithium ion battery supply chain and the EV industry that's just starting to grow in the United States. So with that imperative of striking the right balance between supply adequacy and preserving security, we had our general policy guidance to start to construct international partnerships and to think about how best to integrate critical minerals issues and objectives into some of our major infrastructure, economic, and diplomatic initiatives. But that sort of provides, I think, the initial grounding for how the US government thinks about these issues and where their motivations are deriving from. And then happy to talk about some of the major policy advancements and other initiatives that the US has undertaken through both the legislative advancements that have been made, but also some of the executive initiatives that exist. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Brad. Mark?
Well, thank you, Bud. The EU has been a front runner in the efforts to shift to a green and digital economy for a long time now. This has been progressed through EU rules, standards, and ambitious targets. In the transition to net zero and a digital economy, it's very much understood within the EU that the EU's competitiveness will strongly rely on its capacity to develop and manufacture the clean technologies that makes this transition possible. One of the clean technologies that the EU has been aggressively supporting is the development of a battery sector. Now, the EU has effectively accelerated, if not created, an EV market in the EU by introducing targets and regulations, something the EU is very good at, aimed at phasing out the sale of petrol and diesel cars by 2035. Of course, the dilemma the EU finds itself in, as with other industrialized countries, is that green and digital technologies currently depend on a number of critical and scarce raw materials that are not currently sourced from within the EU. Now, the EU has recognized the importance of access to critical raw materials for some time now. Back in 2018, it launched a raw materials initiative. But for a traditionally open and trade-focused economy, the issue of securing critical raw materials has perhaps not been on the front burner of the EU. But the EU has, of course, experienced over the past decade a series of shocks to the single market. And the single market is the EU's greatest achievement and the source of its economic and geopolitical strength. This has included the financial crisis, Brexit, the Trump presidency, and the ebbing and support of and faith in the multilateral trading order, COVID, and the exposure and fragility of global supply chains. And this has left the EU feeling vulnerable. In the case of securing critical raw materials, the EU has been actively ramping up its efforts to secure reliable and responsibly sourced critical raw materials. Now, two more shocks have come to the EU single market that have had a profound, if not an existential impact on the EU. The first, of course, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the consequent impact on energy sources and prices. It's again left the EU vulnerable, particularly when Russia shut off the gas supplies in retaliation to sanctions. And there's, of course, fears that China could use its dominant position in raw material supply chains to exert similar pressure against the EU in the future. And of course, the introduction by the US of the IRA and the fear that EU industry will leave will basically hollow out the EU manufacturing sector, in favor of US tax incentives, and also a fear of loss of talent and technology out of the EU. The EU is responding to this in its recently unveiled Green Deal Industrial Plan. The key parts to this plan are the Critical Raw Materials Act, which was announced just a few hours ago today. And that plan will look to promote domestic mining, promote recycling, as well as identify strategic projects abroad. The second aspect of this is the Net Zero Industry Act, again, published just a few hours ago today. And the idea there is to accelerate technology rollout of European clean tech manufacturers, things like batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines. Another aspect is the state aid review, which was announced on March the 9th. And this would again give member states the ability to provide a great amount of subsidies to certain businesses and industries. And there's also the possibility of EU additional funding for particular projects through something like the Sovereignty Fund, but that has not been released yet or announced and remains a possibility. Again, we'll find out in the summer. In the few seconds I have remaining, let me just say that there is a big role for Canada in this EU story, and I would certainly encourage Canadian companies to look very closely at developments in the EU, and hopefully that's something we can talk about a little bit more on this panel discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Marianne.
Thanks, Bud. There's a lot to build off of Bradford and what Mark is saying, but it's really exciting time in Canada in this space. In the last few years, the Canadian government has really focused its attention on the critical minerals sector. And I know many of our viewers are familiar with it, so I don't want to belabor it, but there are 31 critical minerals and metals the government has identified as being areas of focus for investment in Canada, but also developing allyships and partnerships with countries, including those in the EU, such as France and the UK, as well as with the United States, among others. Just to back up a little bit on why this is an exciting time, particularly in the month of March, is last year around this time when the federal government delivered its federal budget, it framed it as a critical minerals budget, investing $3.11 billion for the sector. This is important because after sort of coming out of the lockdowns of COVID, and there's been a lot of government investment, I think there was a lot of appetite among the electorate, but also the business community in how do we make Canada more competitive global marketplace in the sector when we're abundant with these resources, and given the geopolitical tensions with Russia, but also China that are quite unique to Canada, with the two Michaels, the diplomats who had been imprisoned for several months in China, followed with the arrest of Meng Wanzhou from Huawei, followed by the general dynamics on the whole that we're seeing right now, quite squarely being scrutinized in terms of potential Chinese interference in Canadian election. So there is a lot of contextual pieces that are framing out how Canada is responding to the sector among and working with its global partners. Why I say it's an exciting time is that the Prime Minister just concluded a visit with the EU President. President Biden will be visiting Ottawa next week. And one of the major focuses is how can Canada play a major role in helping our allies have less reliance on China in particular, while also navigating the dynamics that the EU has in terms of the reliance it has on Russia for many of its energy sources. Now, before we get into some of these details and more of a deeper conversation, why everyone's waiting with a bated breath here for our federal budget, which is going to be announced on March 28th, or delivered, I should say, is that since the budget from last year, we've seen a critical mineral strategy introduced from the government that is focused very much on engagement in terms of partnership with Indigenous communities, clean jobs, building a digital economy. But there wasn't a lot of teeth to it. And a lot of folks in the sector are keen to see what sort of details or any additional dollars that will be outlined and build off of last year's federal budget. So I'll pause there, Bud, because I think there's a lot we could tap into in terms of the dynamics between the US and EU, but I hope that sets the stage somewhat in terms of where Canada finds itself in this moment in time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marianne, and thank you to each of you. You've really laid out a lot of really interesting avenues, I think, that underscore the tensions, not just with geopolitical rivals like China, but the tensions within putative allies like Canada, the United States, and the EU. It's going to be a great conversation. I want to remind viewers that they can pose questions in the Q&A function of Zoom, and later on we'll look at those questions, see if we can answer a few of them. So I'm going to throw out some headliner questions. We're going to go in the same order. I'm going to start with Brad. And this was something that Mark mentioned. So the USA, through the Inflation Reduction Act, has allocated hundreds of billions of dollars to create a domestic EV battery chain and displace China. China dominates those global supply chains now. What effect does the heightened geopolitical tension in the Chinese-US relationship mean for American ambitions?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Bud. Look, fundamentally, the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'll couple in there the bipartisan infrastructure law as well, just because there's a pretty historic volume of investment being made through the infrastructure law into the battery supply chain as well, that I think is important to bear in mind here as we think about the incentives that the IRA provides for the EV industry and for battery supply chains in the United States. Fundamentally, they really do represent a renaissance for industrial policy in the United States. I think the kind of underlying thesis behind them is that the only way you're going to be able to sustain momentum behind climate action in the US is if there's broad-based economic dividends that are tangibly evident from that energy transition that is necessary in order to arrest the growth of emissions in the United States. But embedded in there is very much a policy imperative to ensure that dependencies on China are not so extensive as to put the United States at a security or economic risk over the longer term as we restructure the foundations of our energy industry in the US. So what that means is a massive shift in the actual composition of the supply chains that the US depends on looking forward, which, short of those substantial investments under the BIL and the IRA, we would be on a path to dependency on China. And that's the current status quo that we are seeking to alter over the course of the next decade. And when you look at just the initial announcements that have been made surrounding new investments in the EV supply chain, it's clear that the IRA incentives are sufficient to drive that type of capital flow towards these projects that will allow for some degree of diversification. I think last I checked, there were 25 new projects representing $32 billion in investment announced, and we're closing in on a terawatt hour of battery manufacturing capacity to be installed in the United States by 2030, a quarter of which has been announced since and because of the IRA. So there is absolutely a historic mobilization of resources that is taking place in response to those legislative incentives. But I think there are a couple of key areas that are going to be really essential to watch in terms of determining just how successful we are actually going to be with what is now, I think, a pretty obvious policy of selective decoupling with China. And the first is, which incentive is really going to drive the tax credit system for electric vehicles in the United States? So this is still very much a work in progress. IRS still has additional measures to take in order to release guidance that will govern the actual implementation of tax credits associated with the electric vehicle. The administration is hard at work on trying to put those out, and they actually missed their initial deadlines to finalize that guidance. Those credits were supposed to go into effect on January 1, but the guidance has been delayed, I think, because of the complexity surrounding a number of the qualifying criteria for the electric vehicle tax credit in particular. To not to get too granular about this, but I think there's going to be a battle between the 30D and the 45W tax credits, the 30D being the consumer vehicle tax credit and the 45W being the commercial vehicle tax credit. The 30D one, for those who are familiar with the IRA, has that very long laundry list of all the qualifications that must be met in order to be deemed eligible, associated with where you're sourcing your raw and processed materials, where you're actually manufacturing the battery, where the vehicle is assembled, and crucially, that you do not depend on what the United States government is calling a foreign entity of concern. And that puts restrictions on companies that operate and are subject to the jurisdiction of, which is the statutory language of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And so how much the FEOC component of 30D plays a role is going to play a major role in just how aggressively and rapidly the United States can decouple from China, because the FEOC component of that tax credit is disqualifying, which means if you're sourcing from CATL, you're likely not going to be eligible for that tax credit. And there are a lot of gray areas to examine that I think are going to be fleshed out in this guidance. But if 45W becomes the main vehicle through which auto manufacturers are seeking to procure that tax credit, none of those same conditions apply. And so the impact of what was written into 30D and the legislative intent to decouple from China and the battery supply chain may be muted depending on how aggressively 45W is leveraged over 30D. And you've already seen just in the release of early preliminary guidance from Treasury that Senator Manchin is extremely upset that 45W holds prospects for potentially being a more prominent tax credit for electric vehicles under the IRA moving forward. The other two areas that I think are crucial to watch here are trade. There's a major Section 301 decision forthcoming in the United States to determine just how extensive tariffs will be on Chinese imports moving forward. In association with those investments that I cited, there are going to be major procurements of capital equipment in the United States from China in the coming years, and how aggressively those are taxed, how China decides to retaliate or not against those tariffs, and frankly, the availability that they're willing to continue to sustain for US importers to access that equipment and that technology are things that could drastically impact how successful the United States is in this build out. And then finally, I think there's some real questions surrounding the growth of the upstream supply picture, and whether or not all of these facilities on the gigafactory side are actually going to be able to meet the raw material requirements to meet the output that they're projecting, and whether non-Chinese upstream projects actually can garner the investments required to feed that new US capacity. Are all of these projects actually going to get built? Are they all going to be able to sustain competitiveness? I think there's some real issues when you start looking at, as you cited, the graphite supply. Class 1A nickel supply is going to be very constrained in future years, and whether or not those companies are able to procure all the raw materials that they need for their component manufacturing is going to be crucial. And that's where things like cathode and anode investments in the R&D space in the United States could potentially contribute to a diversification of battery chemistries in a way that allows for further decoupling to happen and would potentially bring some relief to the upstream picture where we see a lot of constraints right now. But those are the areas that I think are going to need to be of keen focus over the course of the next years in terms of how successful this decoupling effort actually is.
Thank you, Brad. And you touched on so many issues, just I think illustrating the complexity of the policy landscape, illustrating the tension and strain points with China, with allies like Canada and the European Union. Mark, let's jump into talk a little bit about the EU, and you mentioned that there's a fair number of efforts going on to grow the number of battery producers established in the EU. Part of that, as I understand, is due to a lower carbon intensity of the European grid, and with the forthcoming, I guess, application of the border carbon adjustment mechanism in the EU. It looks like low carbon players in the EU are going to have kind of an advantage, a competitive advantage against high carbon imports from Asia. Just getting a sense is that as just a starting point, that's one element of Europe's approach here. How is that dynamic that's going to play out across the Atlantic? How does the EU set up in competition with the US and with Canada?
Well, thank you for the question, but it's the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, as it's often referred to, is of course a tool developed by the EU to put a price on carbon emissions during the production of carbon-intensive goods entering into the EU, with a view to trying to encourage cleaner industrial production in non-EU countries, but also, of course, to, I guess, insulate European manufacturers who, of course, are operating within the requirements of the EU market. Now, the first phases of the CBAM covers imports of aluminum, cement, organic fertilizers, hydrogen, steel, but it doesn't yet include mined products. How this will play out, it does remain to be seen. As you pointed out, it's not in effect yet. It hasn't been formally adopted, although it's expected to be adopted in force by October later this year. Of course, the empirical evidence, and what we've seen in the news, is that it would suggest that CBAM itself is not going to be enough to stop producers from looking to North America. This week alone, we've seen an announcement by Volkswagen to build a new battery facility in St. Thomas, Ontario. This follows other companies, European companies, who've made similar announcements in terms of investments in Canada, including Umicore and BASF. And of course, there's a number of other European companies that have looked to the United States, or at least are thinking about the United States, including a company called Northvolt, Swedish battery group, that has yet to decide to build a third factory in the EU, where it was assumed it was going to do that. CBAM has been a flagship policy of the EU for a while now. It's been in the works for a while, so I think it's safe to assume it's going to remain. What will be interesting to see is if countries like Canada, which also has a carbon pricing mechanism of its own, will follow suit. But again, I'm not sure how much it will impact, CBAM will impact the production of batteries in the EU. The relocation, as I understand it, is really a function of other factors, things like the IRA incentives, as Brad has pointed out. Those are pretty significant numbers. There's also less regulatory hassle, at least that's the perception in the EU. And then again, also there's access to clean power as well, which again, the EU is in the process of ramping up. And the EU is in the process of addressing all of these things. The question is, how quickly they can do it. But apart from the CBAM, I think other areas that the companies, including Canadian companies, should be looking at are other regulations that the EU has put in place that will, I don't want to use the word protect, but certainly provide the EU market with high quality batteries as opposed to just volume. And these are batteries that are manufactured to certain standards, not just in terms of consumer protection, but in terms of environmental impact and also labor standards as well. And these are things that Canadian companies should be looking at, because of course Canada has very similar standards to the EU in this regard, and therefore should be seen as a logical market. It's also fair to say that these companies that have relocated have not just picked up sticks and left the EU. They're in effect hedging their investments. And so again, this is very much a dynamic process. It remains to be seen, but the EU really is focusing on quality. One other point I should point out is the batteries regulation that the EU has introduced recently. And again, that puts in place certain minimum requirements for batteries that are imported into the EU market. These require, like a lot of other EU legislation now, to have a degree of due diligence to ensure that labor standards are met. It's not created by forced labor. that there is a certain recycling content. Again, it's not surprising that President von der Leyen's visit to Canada included a visit to a recycling plant, Li-Cycle, in Canada, and also that it contains a battery passport, which will help facilitate. So again, to basically provide an outline of what the battery components are to help recycle and also repair these batteries going forward. So again, I think the EU the package needs to be looked at as a whole. CBAM is definitely one part of it, but there's other regulations as well.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, I'm quite interested in the global the global battery passport issue, which is being driven, I think, by EU interests as sort of a quality indicator, just to make it easier to move these things around. We can perhaps dig into that a little bit later. Marianne, so we've heard a deep dive from Brad about the complexity and the enormity of the IRA. But Canada and the US are collaborators as well as competitors in this space. And over the past several months, and as we're waiting for the budget to be released on March 28th, the Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, has emphasized Canada needs to counter both US and EU inducements for incentive or for investment. And that seems like a challenge. What might we see in the future in the budget? What are the options Canada has?
It's an excellent question, and I wish I had a crystal ball to answer, but I'll answer as best as I can. There's been a lot of media reporting and the minister herself stating, so to speak, it's not tit for tat, or it's not dividing up the pie, it's about growing the pie. And very clearly articulating with the US in particular that Canada is not going to be able to have the same types of competitive incentives as the United States has. But I really like the point that Mark drew on of that there's other opportunities for Canada to think about the regulatory system and how we draw this out without, decentralizing companies and the sector or our governments to work together, but also ensuring Canada remains competitive globally. For our viewers, I was saying to our panelists yesterday when we gathered, is that if I can be so candid, that Canada typically does a really good job at being mediocre in some sectors when they could be the best. And this is a really stunning time for our country where we could be the best. And we need to provide the regulatory framework for business and for people to come and want to invest in Canada to make it attractive to them. And so what we're all waiting for is on March 28th, when the markets close, for Minister Freeland to describe what that could look like in detail in this year's federal budget. We know there are a variety of incentives that are already in place, and given our federation, there's some that are also on the provincial scale, and it will also be looking at how does the federal government work with its allies domestically, our governments across Canada, to attract businesses in terms of when it comes to manufacturing and so on and so forth. So all this to say that it's been made very clear on the record that there is a real focused going forward on working collaboratively with partners like the US and EU, but not insofar that it decentralizes folks from being less competitive. But I don't want to go on too much longer because there's a lot of questions in the chat that touch on this, and several of them are long and detailed, and I'll try my best to maybe summarize them, but maybe we could give the people what they want and touch on some questions. Does that?
I think that's a great idea, Marianne.
Is that a good
Thanks.
transition? I hope we can sort of touch on all of them. Maybe I'll just throw this one quick one to Brad that came in like at the door at the beginning of the webinar. Brad, at a high level, What was the gap analysis of the U.S. domestic mineral/metal resources required for solar, EVs, et cetera?
Yeah. Look, I think the kind of high level takeaway was that geologic realities are such that the United States is not going to be self-sufficient from a raw material perspective to enact its energy transition, full stop. I think we're bullish on a couple of opportunities that exist. Lithium, I think, being a primary example where the recoverable reserves are attractive. There's, serious projects that are starting to gain traction, gain financial support, that could change the supply picture for lithium in the near term in the US going into the battery supply chain, where I think the United States will emerge as a meaningful lithium producer globally, and will be able to meet some of its internal domestic needs on the basis of upstream production in the US. But there are other clear critical minerals where the US either doesn't have the geologic reserves or they exist in areas that are going to be exceedingly difficult for them to come out of the ground. I already cited nickel and graphite as being some of those shortfall areas where I think we see some real sustained import dependency moving forward. But I think the intent of that exercise wasn't entirely to get a granular view of the actual volumes the United States is going to be producing, but to make sure that the investments that we're making domestically complement what we're doing on the international side, so that when we are seeking out partnership with Canada, for instance, we're emphasizing where comparative advantages exist on both sides of the border, and so that we're simultaneously contributing to an enhanced supply picture that allows for both of our energy transitions to continue apace. And then I think about some of the other international initiatives that we have related to critical minerals that does need to reflect, I think, a balance between what we think the domestic picture can produce in order to prioritize appropriately the types of minerals and the types of projects that we want to invest in as a government overseas.
Marianne, keep them coming.
I was just going to say, is it okay if
Yeah, let's do it.
So I think we could all probably touch on this, but maybe Mark, you could start. In light of the intensifying competition to secure access to critical minerals, which are often found in developing nations with limited institutional and governance capacities, what actions do you believe the EU, US, and Canada should take to support these countries in effectively managing their mineral sectors?
Well, thank you for the question. Obviously, it's a highly relevant one. In the case of the EU, there's clearly an identification for targeting critical projects or projects that are deemed to be strategic to the EU and to help support and fund those projects. This is part of the Critical Raw Materials Act. Again, it was unveiled today, so I haven't really had a chance to delve too into it. That said, I am aware that the fact that the idea is not just to simply secure the resources, but to help these countries to move up the value chain in terms of processing as well. So the EU is really targeting more value add when it comes to their investments in some of these countries, which again would probably would go into things like rule of law and other areas. And I think that's where the EU is drawing the lines on where they can compete vis-a-vis the Chinas and the Belt and Road Initiative.
And just to add on to that from the U.S. perspective, I think this is an enhanced priority within the U.S. government in terms of how foreign aid budgets and capacity building efforts are being implemented. I think the realization that there are a number of new market entrants when it comes to upstream production and key critical minerals has garnered the realization that the regulatory incentive schemes and the policy frameworks that support those upstream industries need assistance. And so I think that's why you see, USAID investing massive amounts into the DRC to help them with a revised mining framework and to try and ensure that there's a stable environment for production there, given their relevance to cobalt supply chains. The State Department's doing a lot through its capacity building programs to focus on improving, investment incentives in the upstream and helping with capacity building across a number of different key regulatory and policy agencies. And so that is going to be a really important, I think, element of the foreign policy and foreign aid toolkit to enhance supply production moving forward, because as Mark said, it does us no good to purely have the United States show up and expect those materials to be extracted and then shipped to the United States. It needs to be a partnership where there's an economic incentive for those countries to ramp up supply, not purely act as a raw material provider to industrialized economies.
Well, maybe I'll jump in there, because another aspect of this effort is the mineral security partnership, which was actually announced at PDAC 2022, which is, I think it's a U.S. led effort, but it has multiple partners. But that's not sending money for economic development. It's a geopolitical tool to exclude, Chinese entry into various places. At least that's my perception. Interesting to hear how, I guess, to boil this down, of the three jurisdictions we're talking about here, the United States, the EU, and Canada, the United States has the most vigorous and forward-leaning geopolitical, political, security angle. And I think the advanced nature of your development on this just gets to the heart of the American viewpoint on this, which is at its heart, it's a national security issue about who controls your economy. So what is the Mineral Security Partnership? How does it differ from what USAID is doing, or what the EU Development Agency or CETA is doing?
Yeah. So I was there at the PDAC launch, and I think one of the articles after the launch, was made public that was describing it, characterized the new grouping as the metals NATO, which I thought was kind of an interesting characterization to make of the partnership, and maybe did a better job of branding it than the U.S. government was able to. But anyways, the Mineral Security Partnership is it's a multilateral initiative that the State Department has pioneered within the U.S. government. There are 11 major European and Asian partners, and the EC being one of those partners, representing its members within the MSP framework. So you have a pretty wide degree of participation. The general thesis there, I think, is to get like-minded partners to travel in the same direction when it comes to critical mineral supply chain policy. And so the success so far has been getting that buy-in and designing a framework that has been attractive enough to enlist those key partners. And they're actively working through a process to start to synthesize project selection criteria, priority project facilitation, as well as the integration of environmental sustainability and governance standards for individual projects that the countries themselves decide to try and facilitate to actual get to financial close. I think the work that's left to do there is this in fact a value proposition that's compelling enough to attract capital to projects that otherwise would not be successful? And is it a substantial enough compilation of U.S. government or international government financing and de-risking tools to catalyze the investments that are needed to get to the supply growth that we all know is needed for the energy transitions that the partners within the MSP have committed to? And so I think that's where the implementation moving forward is going to be really essential to whether or not this is going to be a successful initiative or not. But I think just gathering that group of countries, given the kind of diffuse set of interest involved, has been a remarkable track record of success so far, but a lot of work left to do on actually implementing and facilitating projects.
Right. Marianne, do you want to pose another question, or Mark, did you have a comment with relation to this? Yeah. All right, Marianne, let's go for some more questions.
Yeah, I'm trying to bundle them so we can keep the conversation flowing. So this kind of follows up on what we were just discussing. What if China were to decide tomorrow that exporting critical minerals to the US and the EU is not in its national security interest? how hard would it be to replace that supply, and what impact would it have on its plans to transition to a low carbon economy? Secondarily, is there a significant risk that China would even take a step like that? I think that's a very good question, and quite topical. Maybe I'll kick off. And it's a fascinating one. I mean, I think it's too early to tell. In the short term, I can't see that happening anytime soon. But as we've seen with the dynamics with Russia and Ukraine, we know that could change very quickly. China relies heavily on trade, and needs many of our allies to help support them. The likelihood that they would pull out anytime soon, in my mind, is unlikely. But my fellow panelists might have other perspectives. So maybe I'll throw it over to you, Brad.
Yeah, it's a provocative question for sure. And I think it's kind of the doomsday scenario that the United States lives in fear of. And it's really the driving motivation behind that selective decoupling is because China has established a track record whereby it leverages its market concentration and market power for geopolitical purposes. I mean, look at how they enact their Taiwan policy with countries that have formal relationships with Taiwan. They use every single economic lever at their disposal to sever those ties. And so there is, I think, a troubling track record when it comes to how China behaves on the international stage, when it views its interest as being its geopolitical interest outweighing potentially its commercial interests. But in this particular case, I think the attractiveness of the US and European markets when it comes to things like batteries and electric vehicles will outweigh any kind of retaliatory motivations that they might have for, decoupling policy, formal or informal, that Brussels or DC pursue. Where I do have some concerns is what I cited regarding the Section 301 decision. Not necessarily specific to that, but I think it's not lost on the Chinese that what the IRA and the BIL are seeking to do is to compete with them from a manufacturing and industrial perspective. And establishing that capacity is one thing, but sustaining it and actually accessing the capital equipment required to build out that industrial capacity is quite another. And that's where I think there hasn't been significant enough attention in terms of some of the dependencies that we have. And we've already seen an announcement by the Chinese that they may actually restrict export of solar manufacturing equipment to the United States to prevent us from building out capacity that reduces the very, very high degree of dependency that we have. And so I think where there should be some nervousness or anxiety about this is on the capital equipment side for some of the gigafactories that are going to be constructed in the United States, where we have major dependencies on China. And the last thing I'll say is that one of the things that we were doing within the US government when I was still there is we were trying to examine where those most severe bottlenecks do exist, where disruptions that may not be geopolitically motivated, but that are, exogenous, whether it's a global pandemic, whether it's emissions control, shutdowns of factories in China, or what have you, could cause major disruptions to the US market. And we started to find a couple of areas in the battery supply chain where there are some very concerning concentrations in areas like the electrolytes and lithium salts, where the Chinese have absolute domination in those components that are critical to lithium ion batteries. But there are very few companies capable of producing at scale those materials. And those are some areas that I think are in need of additional attention, just to make sure that we have adequate diversification.
Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to that, I don't have very much to add because I agree with the comments, but the fact of the matter is that there is a high degree of concentration in a lot of these areas, which the EU is very sensitive about. Again, going back to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is a heightened sensitivity of how not being, let's say, completely autonomous in the sense of being able to procure the things that's needed within the EU market. So this is a concern. It's a concern that's very sensitive given recent events. From the EU, how easy it is to replace these things is of course they're not easily replaceable, because again there's such a bottleneck on and time delay on developing mineral projects. This will take a long time to replace. The EU has been relatively successful, in fact actually quite successful, in addressing the energy issue resulting from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, largely because there have been other suppliers. They've been able to go out to the market and purchase alternative energy, energy from alternative suppliers. The same is not the case when it comes to critical raw materials, and that's a point that again the Europeans are very sensitive to, as I know the Americans and Canadians are as well.
I was just going to say, pulling together the two conversations here, really it ends up at its bottom. This is a zero-sum game. There's only so many resources, whether financial or critical minerals, where this stuff can come from. And at the end of the day, the two biggest economic blocs, the EU and the United States, and Canada, and nicely straddles, I guess, the two, it seems to me, are going to be in conflict. So the geopolitical tension that's focused on China, at some point, and we're seeing this emerging tension, is actually going to be between democratic free market economies, because it's sort of a zero-sum game. I'm wondering, is there any reaction to that? I mean, it looks like everybody's talking about partnership. So everyone's talking about we're going to have to work together to get these things done. But we, of course, do see that at the end of the day, local politics matter, and the U.S. had instituted a series of I guess policies that looked like Canada was going to be harmed, for example, in the EV subsidies and so on. And I'm just wondering, do you think we're going to get through this as partners and get towards that net zero economy we're all hoping for, or are there challenges on the horizon? Mark.
Sure. I would agree with you, Bud, in the sense that at the moment it's a zero-sum game, because it's, the US, the EU and Canada have, and other countries have allowed it to become a zero-sum game, because they've allowed the concentration of these critical raw materials to be in China. I think what we're seeing in the EU, the US, and hopefully in Canada is really just trying to change the dynamics of that game, so that there isn't a dependency on one or just a few suppliers. I think if they're successful, and I'm confident they will be successful, I think the dynamics of the rules or the game will change, and we may not necessarily be heading for that conflict. It does require a high degree of coordination and discussion amongst like-minded, let's say, countries and blocs. So it's encouraging to see Canada, the US, and the EU in discussions. I'm particularly encouraged by the Canada-EU conversations that do take place, for instance, particularly on the critical raw materials file. I don't see much in the way of fault lines. I think what we see is an EU market who's very keen to do business with Canadian businesses. In fact, I'd say they're very eager to do it, and I think Canadians should be looking to the EU because of that, the desire. Again, the EU sees Canada as being a like-minded partner, and in terms of values, and also a reliable partner as well.
Brad, anything to add?
Yeah, look, I'm bullish on the opportunities for US Canada. I think there's too much natural symbiosis there for there not to be a meaningful partnership for a build out of a North American EV and battery supply chain. I think the raw material endowment, the high degree of innovation that's happening across both sides of the border, and now the statutory kind of obligations to pursue that through the IRA are a pretty compelling set of enabling conditions for that to really become a much more meaningful component of the bilateral relationship moving forward. Hopefully there's some, references to that momentum in the Biden visit that's upcoming here. I think that'll, of course, be a core part of the conversation. It figures very prominently in the bilateral relationship already, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth and collaboration there, and something you and I have talked about extensively, right, Bud? is looking at, the respective comparative advantage that exists on both sides of the border and starting to think about how to make that collaborative advantage. So I think there's a real opportunity to do that. With the Europeans, look, I think we're getting to a point where the initial kind of uproar and reaction to the IRA is starting to thaw. The Ursula von der Leyen visit to Washington in the last week produced, I think, some positive rhetoric coming out of both capitals in terms of moving past the initial concerns about protectionism or trade issues that might have surfaced in association with the tenets of the IRA. And I think it was actually one of Macron's key Brussels acolytes had a really, I thought, astute quote just in the last week saying that he'd rather engage with the Americans on a positive competition on climate than to complain about what the Americans are doing domestically. And I saw that as the first comment from a European policymaker and thought this is someone who actually understands the potential here and is pivoting the conversation to a much more productive line of thinking. So hopefully that kind of outlook starts to take hold in Brussels and in some of the key capitals across Europe, so that we can move past the bickering about who can out incentivize the other and start moving towards building out these industries in a way that allows for supply chain resilience, diversification, and the meeting of our climate targets ultimately.
Thanks. We have about 4 minutes left. I'm wondering, Marianne, if there's any question that jumps out at you that we should address that we might be able to run through quickly.
I think, and this was something I really wanted to bring up, and we focus really predominantly on the trade aspects, but someone has mentioned a particularly like Canadian focused question about the relationship with the federal government and our First Nations people, and like how this is all going to work in terms of when most of the minerals are on their land. And that was one of the key pieces in the strategy, the critical mineral strategy that the government cited as part of its way to engage more fulsomely, not only just in terms of building the Indigenous economy, but also as part of its commitment for reconciliation. And I actually didn't know this until recently, but the mining sector is the second largest private sector employer of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And we're already seeing a real interest, at least in my experience, working with different companies and organizations in partnering with Indigenous communities and not being told you have to, but there's like a real interest in wanting to do that. And I think that also sort of touches on some of the dynamics with working with developing countries and our commitment to human rights laws and making sure our labor practices are sound. So I know we're really tight for time, but I think we'll also see a lot more detail on what that can look like in the federal budget, and hopefully see more robust partnerships between the sector and Indigenous communities going forward in Canada.
That's an excellent point, Marianne. And in fact, the government, I think Canadian government is due to release the draft action plan to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples sometime later this summer. So in Canada, this is going to be a huge issue, is getting everybody on side who has the rights to this sort of, for these critical minerals and other resources. We have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to throw something out. We got each about 30 seconds maybe. What are the key indicators we should be looking for over the next 12 months to signal process or progress? Let's start with Marianne.
The friendshoring framework. I think we need to keep having these conversations with each other. And I think that, the heads of state meeting on this and making a priority is a step in the right direction. And we have to keep on that track and keep working together in order to get to the goals we all mutually want to achieve.
Thank you, Marianne. Mark.
Very quickly, I would say the key indicators in the EU would probably be the level of EU subsidies and other responses to the IRA, the amount of money that the EU might be willing to invest in clean tech projects. Again, we have to wait for the summer on that. Probably the biggest cost will be the cost of energy in the EU and how it goes forward. But again, I'd also be very cautious or keen to look at the implementation and rollout of new legislation and its impact, not just on EU markets, but also third countries like Canada seeking to do business in the EU. Things like the battery regulation, supply chain due diligence directive, forced labor regulation, all of which have due diligence obligations and require a degree of conformance to EU labor environmental standards. And again, Canadian business would do well to follow these, particularly for a market that's very eager to be served by Canadian businesses.
Thank you, Mark. Brad, the final word to you.
An enviable position here. A couple of indicators on my side. I mean, one is the emerging partnerships between autos and upstream producers, and how much willingness auto manufacturers are going to have to invest in various segments of the supply chain to ensure resource adequacy. And I think there was a big announcement just a week or so ago with Lithium Americas and one of the major US automakers. So that capital allocation to upstream projects to ensure that the targets that companies and the administration in DC has set can be met is something that's going to be very, very vital. And then on the US government side, I think two key indicators to look at coming out of the Department of Energy. One will be the Loan Programs Office is starting to allocate massive amounts of money into the supply chain, and the companies that they're supporting and kind of the unique characteristics surrounding them is a strong indication of policy preferences for the US for what the supply chain should look like. So I would be watching that closely. There's a lot of focus on critical minerals in the LPO shop these days. And then also the next round of battery grants is probably going to be announced at some point this year. So that's the $3.5 billion plus allotment for new battery grant awards following last year's announcement. And that's really starting to look at some next gen opportunities for how to diversify chemistries, how to look at different materials, and where the US is placing bets for how not just to compete with China, but actually to advance beyond some of their capabilities when it comes to technology. So I think those are going to be a couple of key indicators really to keep an eye on, just in terms of what success is possible in this supply chain.
This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, panelists. Thank you to our viewers. Thanks, Marianne, for pulling the questions and helping out. It's been a fantastic conversation. So much to take away, so much to continue to think about. Thank you, everyone.